Good morning and welcome to the 22nd meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have apologies this morning from Ross Greer. He's once again battling through housing amendments. However, he hopes to be with us fully once more post-recess. The first item on our agenda today is an evidence session with Joe Griffin, Permanent Secretary to the Scottish Government, on issues relating to public administration in government. Mr Griffin is joined by Scottish Government officials, Leslie Fraser, Director General Corporate, Gregor Irwin, Director General Economy, and Richard McCallum, Director of Public Spending. I welcome you all to the meeting and invite Mr Griffin to make a short opening statement. Good morning, Mr Griffin.
Good morning, Convener. Thank you very much for this early opportunity to engage with the committee to discuss my priorities and any matters of interest relating to public administration in Scotland. First, I'd like to thank my predecessor, JP Marks, for his leadership and service. I will continue JP's strong focus on delivery, developing our infrastructure and professional capability to advance the government's priorities and improve the lives of the people who live and work here. With the appointment of a new permanent secretary, this is a moment to focus on our people's engagement and values. Our organisational vision talks of being in the service of Scotland by creating a civil service that is dynamic, diverse and connected. Having served in the Scottish Executive, then Government, for nearly 20 years, it matters a lot to me that we realise this vision and are able to live up to the challenges before us and the expectations of our communities. In my first few weeks, I've been engaging with colleagues and meeting delivery partners around the country, all focused on achieving the government's 4 priorities: tackling child poverty, growing our economy, reaching net zero and improving public services. I believe this outward focus is one of the best ways of being able to advise ministers, linking statistical and analytical evidence with lived experience and understanding the practical connections between and across areas that are otherwise potentially siloed. In addition, public confidence in governmental institutions depends on our ability to deliver real visible results. This too comes with a strong connection to place. Scotland's scale, agility and sense of shared purpose gives us a great opportunity to base public policy on an understanding of place, and I'm committed to using that to full effect. I'm very proud of my executive team, some of whom have joined me today to put their more detailed and expert capability at your disposal. We meet regularly as a team and with Cabinet to drive delivery in line with the government's programme. Our ability to work across organisational boundaries is key, as well as our collective leadership to build capability and ensure the highest standards of governance, accountability, financial management and transparency. As ministers set out last week, further reform is needed across our public sector. The public sector reform strategy sets out a clear vision for change towards a smaller, more agile public sector that delivers better value, eliminates duplication and develops deep digital capability to improve our public services. The Scottish Government must be part of that, playing a leading role in reducing in size and adopting the best of reform and digital capabilities to improve how we do things. How we lead change is crucial, and this needs to be done with kindness and with skill, taking people with us, but also with the determination to do the right thing. It is important too that we are taking a long-term view. Recent publications setting out our analysis of future trends, the need to improve population health and tomorrow's medium-term financial strategy and related delivery plan are examples of this. We're reforming the National Performance Framework to serve as Scotland's strategic roadmap and to sharpen up its utility to test priorities, guide investment and track policy progress. The Scottish Government has an obligation to balance the budget, however challenging the external circumstances. As Principal Accountable Officer, I will continue to strengthen our regime of medium-term planning, accountable officer assessments and providing good advice to ministers on options to live sustainably while driving economic and social value from the Scottish Government's £60 billion budget. Finally, I'm committed to openness and transparency. We're continuing to sustain improved FOI performance, ensuring government business is conducted on government systems with the new mobile messaging apps policy, providing clear performance reporting in our annual accounts, and reviewing and improving transparency in our management of strategic commercial assets. Convener, I hope this gives you a sense of the purpose and vision I have for the civil service. I look forward to discussing our capabilities and commitment to effective public administration more fully this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very helpful opening statement. Not that it really was helpful, because it's blown away a lot of the questions I was actually going to ask. So, but I've been scribbling down some more as you have been speaking. I mean, one of the issues you obviously touched on was the size of the civil service, and that's obviously causing a number of concerns. I mean, it's been described by some opposition politicians and indeed the media as bloated. And you yourself have said you want, in this statement, the civil service to be smaller and more agile. So I'm just wondering what you feel the optimum size of the civil service is in Scotland, and how long you believe it will take to get there.
Thank you, Convener. I don't have a figure for an optimal size. The Minister for Public Finance, in launching the public service reform strategy last week, talked about £1 billion worth of savings over the next 5 years by improving efficiency, reducing duplication across the public sector. The Scottish Government needs to be part of that in terms of how we look at our workforce. Some of the increases in recent years have been driven by the adoption of new powers, responding to crises like COVID. But now we're through some of those, are in more steady state with some of the additional responsibilities. I do believe that we can make some reductions, and we've already begun on that journey. We're down some 5% over the course of the last 3 years. So no optimal size in mind, Convener, but certainly that's the direction of travel.
I mean, say make some reductions, you talk about 5% over 3 years, but surely, you know, if there is an optimum size, and there must surely be an optimum size, one would have thought that you'd be looking to say, well, what is the optimum for each department, and how can we, and if we do have a figure for that, then there must be a way of reaching it. Surely it's just a bit woolly to say, well, we don't really know, we're just kind of, it's almost as if you're moving in the darkness in that regard, and, you know, it's hardly, it doesn't really inspire, I think, if you're actually saying we don't really know what the target is that we're actually aiming for, does it?
Well, I think, so the question was about the optimal size. I think we're in a pretty dynamic environment. I think the way that things have panned out over the last few years, I'm not sure how you would reach a number to come up.
I mean, you've got, sorry to interrupt you,
yeah,
but I mean, you've got to look at what you want to achieve,
yeah,
and then you've got to say within what number, but then surely you have to say, well, what's the optimal number of people we need to achieve that,
yeah,
and deliver that? But
I think what I was saying was that what you're trying to achieve is a pretty dynamic proposition at the moment because of the volatile environment that we're in. But the direction of travel certainly needs to be one of continued reduction. Apart from anything else, of course, that relates to budgets, and ministers will set the budgets as relates staffing and its position with the other priorities that they wish to pursue, and the money that goes more directly to public services is a consideration there. But there isn't a sense of an optimal size. In respect to targets, I mean, I'm open-minded. We haven't set a target at this point. If in further discussions, including with ministers, they wish us to set a target, I've no sort of particular opposition to that. It's just we haven't done up to this point.
But although ministers may wish to set a target, but sure that'll be based a lot on what the advice that you and your colleagues actually give them to see what the deliverable target is. I mean, what people want to do is, the reason I use the word optimal is people don't just want to see a reduction in the number of people if it actually impacts adversely the delivery of service, but what people want to see is what's perceived to be a more efficient, more effective delivery of those services.
Yeah, absolutely. And I share that aspiration. I think I'm just sharing with you the challenge of reaching a number that you could stand by and say that that is an optimal number for the functions that we're required to carry out, and in light of a situation where we're constantly having to respond to different challenges.
It doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, 6,231 to pick a number out of thin air. Surely it could be a kind of band if there's 7,000 just now, you know, give or take. I mean, would it be 6,000 to 6,500, for example? Would it be a narrower banding than that? That's the kind of thing I'm trying to look at where we're going with this.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm happy to take that away, and we can reflect on that. That's not something we've done up to this point for the reasons that I've given. We can have a discussion with ministers about whether they feel that's something that they would want to do. But as I say, I can see some of the challenges involved in trying to reach an optimal number, even if it comes to the suggestion of a range.
I mean, obviously you were Strategy and External Affairs Director prior to your current post, and you'll know a lot of your colleagues well, and you'll know the government well, which is why you've obviously are in the post you're in now. Have you been able to determine what departments are doing best and which, if any, are performing suboptimally, and if so, how will they be improved?
So just on a slight technicality, we don't have departments in the Scottish Government. One of my predecessors, John Elvidge, really changed the operating model to dismantle. I know the point you're making, but just for the record on the technicality. So I think
you can call it directorates if you want.
Of course. It's just there's many more of them. So if you're comparing some of the data as regards directorates, there's a lot more of them. So I think that'll be something that I'd be looking at in my performance management, my line management of my Director General colleagues here, looking at their objectives, the specific things that they are trying to achieve in support of ministers. And that will almost certainly involve actually a point in relation to the workforce and the ability to live within the delegated budgets for the staffing that they've set out. So I think that would be something in the line management relationship.
I had a sneaking suspicion you wouldn't want to mention any that are performing suboptimally, but are there any that are performing exceptionally well that you can look to as a beacon for others, for example?
I think there are strong aspects of performance in different places. You'll forgive me, Convener, I'm not going to sort of single out people at this point.
I knew it'd be a struggle, but I thought I'd try my best,
Yeah, I think there's a broader point about the performance framework, if I may, and maybe we'll come on to that a bit later, but I think I'd like to see the national performance framework in a place where it is clearer and much more public how we're getting on with the achievement of outcomes, and I think that's the really important thing that people need to know about.
To be fair, that was probably the last question I was going to ask you as we progress, but I'm glad you've actually touched on that, because I think one of the concerns of the National Performance Framework is just how widely it is used within government. There's a kind of feeling among the committee that there's perhaps too much lip service paid to it, and it isn't actually used as a working tool. So is that something you feel you want to really change? And
I certainly feel so. I feel two things about National Performance Framework. One is I think we need to simplify the vision of what we're trying to achieve. I think it's a lovely vision at the moment, but I think what ministers are looking at is whether we can make that more of a strategic prospectus with some specificity and greater clarity. And the second point is exactly that it's used as a much more vibrant tool and indicator of our performance. I can give you an example of when we have used it. So in my time in education, we noted that the statistics relating to early childhood development after COVID were deteriorating. That's a really important area of public policy, because that's the point at which children's brains develop and giving the sort of most indicative prospects for people as they then get older. So when that data came out, we needed to respond to that. We pulled together a programme for measures that we could take to try and improve those statistics, gave it some prominence in the programme for government as a specific commitment that the government adopted. And that's the sort of thing that I would expect my teams to do, to be in touch with the trends of data, where things are heading in the wrong direction, to assemble the evidence, mobilise stakeholders and get together a plan of action to turn that around. One
of the issues with the National Performance Framework is that when the programme for government comes out, it doesn't even seem to connect directly to it. So that's one issue. Another issue, of course, is that many of the organisations, and certainly the wider population, don't really have much understanding of what the National Performance Framework is. So it seems to be something that bubbles around in the background, but isn't really as prominent as perhaps it was intended to be. Is that a fair comment, I think?
I think when it first came in, and what it still does, is a reminder of the point of government and public services, which is to achieve a range of outcomes. That's why we're here. There's a degree of administration, there's a degree of, dare I say it, even bureaucracy, but fundamentally we're here to try and drive improved outcomes for people in the real world. That's where I want to see it be, and I want to make it, give ministers the best possible advice really on how they can make it more relevant, realising there'll be a challenge to cut through to the public on a range of things sometimes, but I think the public deserve to know what the performance of the government is, and anything that we can do to clarify that and to make that a really vibrant document for us to use internally as well is where I'd like to go.
We've seen in some of the indicators that the Scottish Government is doing, is progressing in some areas, staying still in others, but in others it's actually falling backwards. So what's being done to address that?
Well, I gave you a specific example there around early childhood development. I think that's the kind of model that that we have in mind. And I think when it comes to elaboration of a programme for government, I mean, actually, specifically, that was an instance where we used the data. But I think the programme for government is informed by a sense of how the government is progressing. And there are actions that make its way into programme for government that are specifically designed to try and achieve those outcomes. And then we have got, I think, much better in recent years in tracking the delivery so that we're sure about whether we're on track to deliver the outputs that then will deliver the outcomes. Whether we sit down and systematically go through the national performance framework line by line, I suspect is probably variable, but it exists as an inspiration. And in my experience, the government and policy areas are pretty on top of the data that they're dealing with and suggesting a direction of travel. But if you could get to a point where public, parliament, government are all using the same reference point through the national performance framework, I think clearly that's a very virtuous place to get to.
Okay, there appears to be considerable resistance from some civil servants to what the public would perceive as a fairly modest proposal that they come into the office at least 2 days a week, with incredulity from many that they don't do that already. After all, public service workers, from refuse collectors to teachers to nurses, all have to be at their work. I'm just wondering if it's your aim to ultimately increase the number of days at the office and what assessment has been done in terms of the performance of people working at home compared to the office, and also the wider picture of people being able to collaborate, you know, and all the kind of social interactions that you have from people at the working collectively together in the one place.
So the decision around how we implement the hybrid model was one that we took collectively quite early on in my tenure, and I'm absolutely certain it's the right thing to do. To answer the last bit of your question first, convener, I think we do believe, and there is evidence to suggest that people working together in person are more likely to engage in high-value activities. So there needs to be a purpose to being together. But things like innovation, creativity, building relationships, working across silos, as I referenced in my remarks, I think that is much more likely to be achieved by people being in person for some of the time. This is about trying to find the right balance. So we are now leading through a process to make sure that from October, people will be together 2 days a week, at least 2 days a week. Some people have reacted to that decision. I understand some of the anxieties that people have. We absolutely need to make sure that we are taking account of diversity and inclusion requirements and how we do that. But the direction of travel is clear for the reasons that I've given. So I think let's secure the 2 days a week policy first. Let's demonstrate the benefits that it brings. Speaking personally and collectively, we have said that we'd be interested in going further in due course, but I think for now the 2 days is what we want to secure.
Yes, I mean, it does seem very modest. I mean, you know, prior to COVID, it was taken as read that people turned up at their work, you know. I mean, generally speaking, certainly, okay, there was, you know, people might have had flexi time, etc., which has been around for decades, but it does 2 days a week, even 2 days a week seems quite a limited amount. So I'm glad you're not going to stop there and you will consider pushing further forward on that.
Yeah, I think it's about finding the right balance, convener. I think what's changed since COVID, I think, is partly the technology is so much better. So the experience of a conference call on the phone prior to COVID was often quite a painful one. The technology now enables much more consistently with pictures as well, a collaborative platform that does work and enables us to engage on a range of activities of a more transactional nature, but it has its limitations. It is a good substitute, but it is a substitute. And I think what we're trying to do is to try and find the right balance and give effect to hybrid in the best sense of that. So that's what we're aiming to achieve.
Okay, thank you. Now you'll be aware that this committee has been carrying out an investigation into the cost effectiveness of public inquiries, given their monumental costs and indeed the many years they seem to take. And what we've seen just in the last week, frankly, we've seen demands from some opposition politicians for public inquiries into grooming and ferries, and no doubt there'll be plenty of others as we progress. But the area I want to ask you about, because we'll produce a report in the autumn, is we've had quite compelling evidence that the current situation whereby a specific budget can be very severely impacted is proving detrimental to services. The opportunity cost, for example, of the police or the NHS having a big chunk of their budget dedicated over a number of years to an inquiry means, quite frankly, that it impacts on the people who would expect to benefit from those services, as NHS and the police have made quite clear. So would you be sympathetic to a budget which was for public inquiries, regardless of what the public inquiry was, regardless of how long it took or it cost, but a budget separate from the budgets of the organisations which are involved in the particular public inquiry?
So I think it's important work that the committee's carrying out, and we look forward to seeing your findings. The executive, of course, as in the government, and the people who work with the government are in a particular position because quite often we are the subject of those inquiries. So it can be difficult for us to look as though we're imposing constraints of any kind on the room for manoeuvre for a chair. And currently, once the chair is appointed, the government will share guidance and advice, but it's up to the chair how to conduct that inquiry. But I understand the point that you're making and the circumstances which have given rise to the inquiry. So I think what I'd say, to try and answer your question as best as I can, is I would certainly look at your findings with an open mind. I'm sort of not sitting here saying absolutely not, but we'd need to understand a bit more around the context, the reasoning, the risk analysis, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's about public services, really.
Of course.
I mean, there may be some injustice happened 5 or 10 years ago, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people, in my constituency don't have a police officer that can call on because that resources haven't been dedicated to an inquiry. So that's why I'm looking at. There's always going to be a cost, obviously. Sure. I mean, even if you take it out the central budget specifically, that it still means it can't be spent anywhere else. But it just seems a particular unfairness. Now, one of the things you talked about as well in your introduction was you talked about place and using it to full effect, which I found intriguing. I'm just wondering if you can maybe expand on that, what you meant by that, just a wee bit more.
Yeah, of course, convener. I think we have an advantage in this jurisdiction. Scotland is a large, complicated country in some ways, but in terms of the numbers of people and the numbers of administrative units, it is manageable. 32 local authorities, etc. And I think what I mean by the importance of place is that, firstly, it's possible to build up the national picture. There's the aggregate picture of the local pictures, if that makes sense. So rather than us asserting a national picture from government, we can really understand, based on data, based on insight, the sum total of the local. I think the second advantage is that of being able to understand some of the specific circumstances of specific places and being able to adapt and change delivery or the formulation of public policy based on a good understanding of that. And the third, I would say, is a relational point, that it is possible to either get people in a room or on a bilateral basis, again, in discussion with system leaders, understand the points that are being made about the specificity of a particular area or why a data set is the way that it is. And we have taken, I think, some steps in the Scottish Government Civil Service to respond to that. So we've had for a number of years a system of place directors, whereby there's a director assigned to each community planning partnership, so contiguous with local authority areas, and that colleague would sit around the community planning partnership table to be able to provide insight from central government and also to report back on the discussions, and then also act as a little bit of an ambassador, sometimes a problem solver, in how things are playing out in terms of public policy. And I just think that's a tremendous advantage for us to be able to be connected in those ways. So that's what I mean by that. I think for that to happen really effectively, I'm keen for my colleagues to be mobile, to be out and about, and trying to role model that myself in my early days. I have in previous roles as well. But I think that ability of central government really to have a good understanding of place, I think, is one that we can make most of here in Scotland.
And in terms of place, are you looking to try and declutter the landscape? Now, there used to be a couple of hundred public bodies. There's now still about 125, 130 non-departmental public bodies of which you are obviously responsible. We've also got local authorities, we've got health boards, we've got integrated joint boards, we've got community planning partnerships, we've got city and regional deals. I wonder how many people in Scotland actually know how all these things work together. I mean, given that there's a population of 5.4 million and across 75,000 square kilometres, is there not an argument for it as part of the reform agenda, and also to ensure more money is spent on the front line of public services, which is what most people want to see for a major decluttering of the public sector landscape?
So the Minister for Public Finance talked about this a bit last week with the launch of the public service reform strategy. He did talk about needing to look at the number of public bodies and indeed the structure of the number of Scottish Government directorates. There isn't a specific blueprint for that at this stage, but I think there's quite a lot set out in the strategy around the direction of travel, the reasons for that, programmes of reform that are currently underway, and I think it's a coherent vision of how various things hang together across different aspects. So that at this point feels like a direction of travel. There are some specific things that the government's taking forward. So there was a merger of a couple of the health boards that was announced last week, which will be taking forward. There's ongoing discussions in some areas about single authorities, but at the moment, I think that is the direction of travel, but as yet there's no specific blueprint for how we'll implement that.
Yeah, I remember calling for that more than 10 years ago, and we're still dipping our toes in the water. So, I mean, you've talked about vision, you've talked about being dynamic. So, it's a pace of change, I think, that's important. And I think what people want to see, I mean, I always think, I've used this analogy before. When I was at university, I never once handed an essay in late, but I never did it until the night before because there was a deadline. And I always feel if there's not a deadline, I mean, you know, you'll just do something else. And that's why I'm one of these people who's very goal and task driven. I think, you know, you like to have something done by a certain date, etc., and you move on to the next item. So it just seems, you know, there's a lot of passion in what you're saying. I think there's a lot of energy, but I like to see things pinned down wherever possible, so that you've got something that you can actually, everyone knows in the direction that they're heading. And so just wondering if there's going to be milestones along the way, to use a kind of UK phrase of the last year.
Yeah, so sort of temperamental. I have a lot of sympathy with that perspective, convener. One of the big programmes that I helped to lead when the implementation of early learning and childcare expansion, I think, was greatly assisted by a timescale. In the end, COVID meant that the full implementation was delayed by a year, but we were on track, and that did help focus minds. I think, as I said, in the strategy, there's a number of work streams which are already well underway. It's a very kind of broad-ranging document. I think for the whole, I think we do need to understand what the delivery vehicle is going to look like. And I wrote to my successor's Director General, Strategy and External Affairs, just at the end of the last week to make that point shortly after the strategy was published, and to ask her, I think, by the end of July from memory, just of a statement of what our delivery vehicle is going to be, that is going to make sure we've got full sight of all these different 18 work streams as they progress. Some of them are already quite well developed and pretty mature in terms of their programme governance arrangements, and some of them are relatively new, so we'll need to put that in place. So I do temperamentally have a fair bit of sympathy for what you're saying, convener.
I mean, one of the things I think is because the government, you know, we've all seen ministers stand up in the chamber and say they bring out a certain plan, strategy, document, whatever it happens to be, refresh, you name it, in the spring. We then find we're in the summer and it hasn't happened. It never seems to be that these documents come out a week early. They all seem to be very early on time, and from my experience, I mean, I just wonder if there's going to be a bit more battening down of the hatches, so that, I mean, ministers are ultimately held account, but the whole Parliament appears to be in a sense of drift when that doesn't happen. It doesn't help anybody. So I'm just wondering whether or not there's going to be a bit more kind of emphasis on ensuring when a deadline is set, a deadline is met, you know, because I think that would inspire a lot more confidence, not just in the government, but in the Parliament and its institutions.
Yes, convener. Again, I do have a lot of sympathy with that, and I followed your previous hearings where similar points have been made. I mean, sometimes there are very good reasons. So the medium-term financial strategy coming out tomorrow was to allow time for the UK spending review to take place. I think it would have been very difficult to have published our strategy ahead of that.
Well, I don't think there's ever any shortage of excuses. I mean, but I mean, the bottom line is surely on occasion, you know, the majority, one would expect that, you know, maybe 7 times out of 10, if you give a deadline, it will be met, or 8 times out of 10. but it doesn't even seem to be anywhere near that. It seems to be almost a cultural thing whereby when we say something is going to happen by a certain time, we've seen that this drift endlessly in this committee, for example, in a whole number of areas which I don't have to recount. I mean, Liz Smith and others are nodding, but it's about a cultural change so that when something is said, it will be done. It will be done.
So I was going on to agree with you.
Right, okay.
And I think one of the things that my predecessor and I did together with others, Gregor, over the last year is to just sharpen up really our delivery discipline. So the creation of a delivery unit within the government, regular routines through the delivery executive that I chair on a weekly basis. I think the programme for government is supported by a dashboard which shows us one track and so on. Capability building I've referred to. There's sort of specifically a playbook for how we ensure that delivery happens. So there is a capability building that needs to happen. At headline level, I agree with you, but the other thing I would say is I need to show, not tell. So I can agree with you temperamentally. I need to demonstrate that together with my colleagues.
Maybe there's too much optimism in terms of when things can be delivered. If they can't be delivered by a certain date, people should perhaps err on the side of caution rather than being over-optimistic. If you say something's going to be delivered in May and it's delivered in April, people are happy. If you say it's going to be delivered in March and it's delivered in April, people are unhappy. You know, so maybe there's an issue there about optimism bias. Just one last thing, because colleagues are keen to come in. The issue of spending, you touched on that in your statement as well, and you talked about delivery discipline. I mean, first of all, I would say there's still issues in terms of this has been raised with the Finance Secretary on a number of occasions about ensuring when the budget document comes out, it's, you know, we're not comparing apples with oranges across portfolios. And I think a wee bit more work has to be done on that. Things I've raised in previous years were still in the last document, so just to emphasise a wee bit of that. But also, we're in a situation whereby, we pass the budget and then a week later we're getting the spring revisions for the previous year, and there's often quite significant changes, but also there's changes that are repeated year after year, and we have this argument as a committee with Cabinet Secretaries about what the policy intention is, delivery intention. I'm just wondering if you're working with ministers to ensure not only that spending budgets are aligned to as tightly as possible, but also that we have that situation, we don't have that kind of Groundhog Day situation occurring every year.
I don't totally follow the Groundhog Day point, Convener.
Yeah, so basically what happens is, for example, we will have a movement of several £100 million from the health and social care budget, to, for example, education, and this it's the same movement every year. And when we question the government on it, we'll say, well, one thing is grounded in policy, another is grounded in delivery. I mean, it just seems to me that if we want transparency, which is what you talked about in your statement as well, it's important that things are done in as clear a way as possible, and we don't have this kind of situation whereby we're going through the same kind of process every year.
Yeah. Look, I'll take that away. I've got my Director for the Budget sitting on my right here, Richard McCallum. I don't know, Richard, if you want to add anything.
Just one thing to say, Convener. I mean, we had your report on the Scottish budget process in the last few days, and that was very helpful, actually, in setting out a number of the recommendations that the committee's referenced, including your point about sort of budget transfers in year. So I know the Cabinet Secretary for Finance has committed to write back to the committee with a fuller response. I know she's sent an initial response in the last couple of days. So we'll be working through all of those recommendations with a view to the budget that's coming up later this year. And I'm sure we'll pick that up further with Cabinet Secretary Finance and with the committee and some of that pre-budget work as well.
Yes, I mean, we will be speaking to the Cabinet Secretary for Finance specifically about that report once we get her response to it. So I'm pleased that you've already taken a lot of that on board. Okay, thanks. I will now move to colleagues around the table. First of all, Michelle, to be followed by Craig.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us, panel. Just following up in terms of public sector reform, what percentage of the 9,000 plus staff you've got are either managers or team leaders?
Leslie Fraser will keep me right with the exact figure. I think the number is just under half, I think, in terms of line managers.
Right. You'll be aware that's extraordinarily high when we look at industry standards. So what plans do you have to change this and by when?
So a good question in line with my last comments about deadlines and so on. So being relatively early in my tenure, I can't give you a specific plan and a specific time. I can give you some assurance that we have discussed this already a few times as an executive team as we come to look at both the size of the overall civil service and also the effectiveness and consistency and the effective implementation and leadership of change. So those statistics around the number of people who are line managers and the number of people that they in turn line manage, which again is relatively small by industry standards, is something that we've broached in conversation. We'll need to bring these things together at some point. I can't give you at this stage a specific plan with timescales, but hopefully that's some reassurance that it is in play.
Okay, and you've alluded to span of control.
Yes.
In effect. Is that? Do you know what the rough sort of ratio of that is? Is it 1-to-1?
I think I'm right in saying 54% of people who are line managers manage 1 or 2 people. Is that right, Leslie?
Okay. Again, that's quite out of sync with what best industry standards are. And I appreciate you're new in post, but going back to an earlier discussion you had with the convener, I personally would always press for specific plans to be put in place with the associated measures. Otherwise, how would we know that we're successful? So I think you can be sure that this is something that I'll look forward to bringing up again when you appear in front of us again. I wanted to move on to mobile messaging apps, which you referenced in your opening statement. And I wanted to ask how you'll ensure that WhatsApp or Signal or whatever are not used for government ministers by staff or ministers on their personal devices. How will you actually ensure that that doesn't happen?
So I think the formulation of the policy has been quite a long time in the making since the Martins report, the Deputy First Minister's statement in the aftermath. There have been good communications, both with ministers and officials, including a briefing for ministers before the Cabinet meeting last week, I think, maybe the week before. So I think that has been really very well communicated. I think it's well understood. We've used our intranet as well to be clear on what the policy now is. So like any corporate policy, now there's an expectation that that will be followed.
Okay. And how will compliance then be measured?
So well, realistically, in terms of the corporate devices, WhatsApp will be removed from those altogether. So that won't be an option. I think, as I say, as with many other policies, we expect it to be adhered to. There isn't a specific enforcement or sort of checking system that we intend to put in place. Okay.
Do you think that's slightly optimistic, given that most people will have personal devices as well? And what you're describing, if it's in effect advisory, there's really nothing to stop them using their personal devices to carry on transacting government business.
So Leslie Fraser might want to come in and sort of add a little bit. I would, maybe I could invite Leslie to come in on that, if I may.
Yeah, so we've been very clear with colleagues that this would be a disciplinary matter. We expect colleagues to follow our information management guidance and policy. WhatsApp and such mobile messaging applications have now gone from government devices. Government business needs to be done on government devices for the benefits of security. As well as traceability and accountability. I think that message is well understood by colleagues, and colleagues are very keen to comply and to work with the new arrangements. And as the Permanent Secretary was saying, we have been able to improve technology available to civil servants. So we do now have access to Microsoft Teams, for example, which fulfills many of the same functions, but is safe, secure, traceable, accountable, and so on. So it would be managed as a disciplinary matter in line with our normal disciplinary arrangements were that circumstance to arise.
But how would you know? Because many people, for example, use WhatsApp with the function set to auto-delete. So how would you ever know? So the process is that people undertake to follow the process.
Yes.
You've said that if they don't, it's disciplinary. But how will you know if they don't, if they're deleting as they go?
The business of government is recorded at all points, and in order for it to be recorded, it needs to be on our devices and on our systems. And so for security reasons, for example, you can't import material easily from elsewhere. You need to produce material on our systems. So we're doing all that we can to encourage and require our colleagues to follow the policies and processes that we have in place. We're also, of course, very clear under freedom of information legislation where somebody, for example, because of a cyber incident or because of a problem with our own systems, to need to do some government business on a personal device, they would need to date stamp that, record the fact, and then arrange for that material to be brought onto the record. So the information remains government business wherever it's done, but we're absolutely clear that except in very exceptional business continuity circumstances, we are anticipating everybody using government devices and government systems.
Okay. I think we'll wait and see. I wanted to ask about the Supreme Court judgment. Obviously, the civil service will operate its kind of 4 key values, particularly around integrity and honesty. But I'm flabbergasted why 10 weeks after the Supreme Court judgment, you're not implementing the law. Why is that?
So first of all, the government's really clear. We accept the ruling and will take the action necessary to implement that. There's a range of action that we have been taking already in a request from the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice. I've convened a short-life working group for all areas to be represented, to take stock of the actions that we need to take to make sure there's a common understanding of where we are and to share any insight that we may be gleaning from other approaches, for example, the UK government or the Welsh government. And these are the actions that we are taking while we wait for the end of the EHRC process to review their statutory guidance. That consultation ends next Monday. I think I'm right in saying they'll then move to finalise that. And once that's finalised, we'll be able to take a further series of actions.
But that's contrary to what Baroness Faulkner says, and I'll quote her. "We have been clear in our public messaging and in direct conversation with duty bearers, including the Scottish Government, that they should not wait for our guidance, but should be seeking to update their policies and practices in the light of the new understanding of the law." So they're quite clear that you should not be doing that, and they emphasise that. They're quite clear that they've stated that to you, so why are you not doing so?
So our understanding of that letter is that is for us to take action. We are taking action where we think that that's appropriate and possible, pending the finalisation of the HRC guidance.
Even although Baroness Faulkner, this is in the public domain, is saying that you should not wait for their guidance.
Well, in order to take action, my point is that we are taking action, but there's a range of different actions. With some of those actions, I think we'll have to wait for the guidance because we have to understand what the statutory regulator is proposing for how we deal with some of the complexities of the situation.
For action at the moment that is talking about it, why then has the Scottish Parliament corporate body unanimously agreed to act with haste to take account of the law? How were they able to do that? And to what extent is that linked to the fact that they bear personal liability if they didn't?
Every public body has to take its own decision in light of their understanding of their legal duties and based on the advice that they are getting. We in the Scottish Government are in a very similar position to the UK Government and the Welsh Government in our understanding of our responsibility being that we need to wait for the guidance for the implementation of some actions. There is a series of actions that we are taking now, so that when the guidance is
So what
finalised...
actions have you actually taken beyond talking about taking action? I'm not clear about that because I haven't seen any guidance beyond every set of wording from every minister and cabinet secretary is we are not doing anything beyond talking. That's the Short Life Working Group. And we're waiting for this guidance that Baroness Faulkner's quite clear you don't need to do. So set out what specific actions you have taken right now beyond talking.
Well, so I think it's specific actions. I can't give you that right now, but the work that's involved in the group and the work that the teams that are represented on the group are taking is to prepare the ground so that when we have an understanding of what the consultation results with by way of the new guidance, we are ready. We understand the policies that are effective and we're ready to implement that once the guidance is finalised.
I referenced that the corporate body, because the members of that bear personal liability, how much do you think that that has affected their actions? For example, if you bore personal liability, do you think you might have acted as quickly as a corporate body?
I don't know what the thinking in the corporate body, and that's a hypothetical question, I guess, in terms of how I would act in a different situation. Our advice is that the correct and the appropriate thing to do is to wait for the finalisation of the guidance.
Despite the risks that incurs, you'll be aware that Sex Matters have already sent a letter dated the 18th of June giving 14 days notice of a letter before action, in other words, a letter before legal action. And I understand it's gone into the public domain today that there's a further email to yourself and For Women Scotland in which they note that if you don't take action, they reserve the right to take further action. So that's two potential further legal cases, which I think, given the strength of the Supreme Court judge, we can anticipate the way in which they would go with potentially a significant loss of public money. I am staggered why you're not acting now and you're saying, well, we need to wait, when Baroness Faulkner says so clearly that they should not wait for our guidance.
So we're not waiting to take the actions that we believe we can take. The advice that we continue to get, and I haven't seen this latest email, but in respect of the reported other intended action, the advice remains that nevertheless we should wait for the statutory regulator to finalise their guidance.
You're in charge. Who's giving that advice? Is this your advice? Because who's giving that advice?
Well, this is advice from the relevant officials that support me in these matters.
But you're accountable. You're the accountable officer.
Yes, that's right.
And so, do you not think maybe you should question that? You're being told that you should wait for advice, and now you've got two concrete threats of legal action. Does that not worry you a wee bit?
Well, as a matter of good practice and operation, I always probe and test and question the advice that I'm given. I am assured that the advice that I've got is the correct advice.
Right.
And as I say, we find ourselves in a very similar position to our colleagues at Westminster and in Cardiff.
Well, I think my firm advice to you would be to look afresh at that. It's no justification under law, frankly, for you to say, well, that's what everybody else was doing. The Supreme Court judgment was compellingly clear. There's a threat of two further potential legal actions. My firm advice to you, Permanent Secretary, would be to get on it, because I think from a public sector, you are ultimately the accountable officer responsible for ensuring the Scottish Government upholds the law. And regardless of your view in this matter, I personally think it's a very poor look that we're 10 weeks later, we haven't done anything about it. Thank you, Convener.
Okay.
Thank you. Craig, followed by Michael.
Convener, good morning, Mr Griffin. I just want to open by just touching on the shape, form and function of the civil service. Almost every chief executive that I've known or know would be able to give you an assessment at any point in time a snapshot in terms of what the optimal workforce should be, whether or not they're too high or too low. Why can't you or the Scottish Government give us an indication of figures in terms of today what the optimal number of civil servants would be to discharge their duties?
I think for the same reason I gave earlier on. I think we operate in a dynamic environment, a volatile environment. Just over the course of the last few years, we have seen things like the war in Ukraine and the requirement to arrange a refugee scheme, which was very hard to predict, where the government needed to respond, and where I think my colleagues conducted themselves superbly in organising that welcome and reception for Ukrainian refugees. And I think it's in the nature of the operating environment and a little bit, me being 10 weeks into the role, that I can't sit here today and give you a figure for the optimal size of the Scottish Government Civil Service.
A file with a work in progress file in terms of with a figure on it.
That wasn't part of my handover, Mr. Hoy.
Okay, fine. So Scotland is a larger public sector than the rest of the UK, and it is better paid than the rest of the UK. And public sector workers in Scotland now earn £2,000 on average more than those in the private sector. What's your assessment 10 weeks in of the sustainability of this position?
Well, I think you can take it from the First Minister's speech last Monday, from the public service reform strategy last week, and then we'll see the medium-term financial strategy and delivery plan tomorrow, that there is a direction of travel of trying to reduce some of those figures. There are different variables in how you manage a budget sustainably, and I think one of the things that absolutely in your gift is to make sure that you're as efficient and as effective as you can be, because the other choices are ones where you would want to try and maintain the levels of public service provision, for example. So I think we've been given a clear direction of travel by ministers, and we need to go ahead and implement that now.
And you would concede the direction of travel means if you continue on it and don't have significant reform of the public sector workforce, there will be less money for public services, frontline public services in future.
Well, the Scottish Fiscal Commission have set out a number of analyses that I think sort of draw that conclusion.
Shona Robertson has said repeatedly that the decision to pay civil servants more and have more of them is an investment. She's used that word. Where is the return on that investment being? Where is the increased productivity within Scottish public services?
So I think measuring productivity in the public sector, I think, is always a difficult methodology. There's a range of things which lend itself to that, some key performance indicators in respect of hitting FOI targets, for example, where performance has greatly improved, answering parliamentary questions, and in our operational functions, somewhere like Social Security Scotland, for example, will have KPIs. Some of the other things are harder to measure in terms of the value added of a creative solution or an innovation and so on. But I think it's important to keep trying in that regard. Again, I would cite one of my predecessors, John Elvidge, who brought into the organisation the concept of public value and the idea that any asset in the public sector should be used dynamically to drive good outcomes and to realise value for the public. But the kind of art and science of how you specifically measure that productivity, other than the more repetitive tasks and sort of output-focused tasks for which there is a methodology and KPIs, has proved difficult over the years.
I convener alluded to this earlier, but since devolution, jobs in the public sector have grown by 19%, but there has been a 98% increase in the civil service, and 40% of that increase is taking place since 2019. This surely can't just be down to additional devolved issues such as Social Security Scotland. Have you broken down the numbers to see where that real growth is taking place?
So I think broadly it is the addition of new responsibilities. Unless one of my colleagues has this to hand, I'd be happy to write to you to break down what we do have. Certainly we'll have the figures for the Social Security Agency and the associated directorate as one of the more significant functions that we brought in.
But there's still a very significant number in there. One area where the Scottish Government have said they have made significant progress is in relation to this contingent workforce. How would you characterise the Scottish Government's efforts in respect of that?
So I think we have been quite successful in bearing down on the number of contingent workers in the last few years. So the numbers I've got here are March 2022, the headcount of contingent workers 2031, March 25 figure is 1,075. So you're seeing quite a significant reduction there in how we've gone about contingent workers.
Further back,
yeah.
And sometimes that's wise to do so. So in 2022-2023, when it peaked, partly because of refugee crisis, social security, etc., number of the cost of contingent workers was £51.2 million. The last public quoted figure I could find was £33.73 million. But yet in 2019-20, it was £27 million. So you're still effectively £10 million more than you were in 2019, but yet the Scottish Government is characterising this as a success.
Well, that number would be even higher if we hadn't borne down on the reduction as I've described there. I don't know if Leslie Fraser has more detail than me.
I think the impact of inflation over the period will be quite significant in relation to those numbers, Mr Hoy. Yes, because the reduction is around 47-48% in the numbers of contingent workers that we're relying on in government.
Okay, but there is, I think, the public will get a sense that as there's been a period of wage constraint in the private sector, we've seen, particularly post-COVID, an increase in the pay gap between those working in the public-private sectors growing to now 2,000. So your average public sector worker in Scotland full-time is earning 2,000 more than those in the private sector in Scotland, and that gap's grown from 400 to 2,000 now. So there is a significant increase there, and there is a sense that we've never had so many civil servants and they've never had it so good. I just looked down the Scottish Government's website in relation to the pay benefits of being in the civil service. So a salary from A3 at 25,000 up to 87,000 at C3, a 35-hour working week, 42 days holidays after 4 years, a very generous pension scheme with employers' contributions starting at 28%, potentially a swimming pool at Victoria Quay, a compressed working week, and this informal policy of working from home. It does look a rather attractive prospect. So where do you think the efficiencies need to be made in relation to the form, function and operation of the civil service? Because it does appear to be that it's a pretty good deal.
So I would agree overall that we are an attractive place to work. I want us to be an attractive place to work. I want to attract the best people to come and support ministers to serve communities across Scotland. The direction of travel that ministers have set out for the public sector as a whole is of retrenchment to be able to release savings. We have to go about that in a leadership role in the Scottish Government, set an example, and some of that will be a reduction in our size. And I think there's lots of different ways that we can go about that. I think some of them have been successful up to this point, 5% reduction over the last 3 years.
Mr Griffin, that's in respect of headcount.
Yeah.
One of the things we also found out, there's been a very significant increase in those top grade civil servants, 500 in the last 3 years. So it's very easy to say headcount is falling, but actually the wage bill is rising and the number of senior civil servants is rising significantly. For what reason is the number of senior civil servants still rising significantly?
So some of that figure, I think, Leslie will correct me, I think is on a technicality where at a certain point, was it April last year, we started counting people that were on temporary promotion to civil service, as well as those were substantively. So that figure is, I think, slightly inflated based on the previous measure. But I understand the point that you're making overall. I mean, civil service pay is reserved to Westminster, so those decisions are taken for the civil service as a whole. But I think where ministers set as a direction of travel, the financial context is one that you correctly describe. I think it is incumbent on us to look at all aspects of our operation. So whether that's the line management position I was discussing with Ms Thompson, or whether it's your point about the senior civil service, I think these are things that need to be in play. And Mr McKee also referred last week to, and it's in the Public Service Reform Strategy, the need to look at the number and structure of directorates and some of the boundaries, if you like, between core government and the public bodies to make sure that there's no duplication. So I think there's an environment and a direction of travel for me coming in as a new permanent secretary to pursue as many avenues of inquiry as possible. As always, we want to do that in close consultation with our colleagues and with our trade union partners as well. But for me, I would want to look at what the options are as we go forward.
I understand you want the civil service to be an attractive place to work, but it's also going to be a realistic place to work.
Sure.
It's also going to be a fair place to work because it is taxpayers' money that is funding it. And many people working in the private sector will be looking at this and just thinking this is not fair nor sustainable. To look at the issue of hybrid working, I noticed that on your website you say that that it's let me quote exactly, as part of our current hybrid working policy, staff members in roles which are suitable for hybrid working have the opportunity to, and I quote, informally deliver work from home. So what is the Scottish Government's formal policy on working from home?
The formal policy is that from October we have a strong expectation.
But what is it presently now?
At the moment, I think, I don't have the word in front of me, Leslie can help, I think it's something along the lines of, I think, an expectation of 1 day a week in the office.
So when it says here that you've got the right to, or an opportunity to informally deliver work from home, I'm not entirely sure what that means. Could you recall all civil servants back in 5 days a week presently under their present employment contracts?
Yes, we could, yes.
And have you thought
conditions haven't changed,
okay.
No.
So why, I suppose, are you being so generous in your approach at the moment, when I think people out there in the real world are thinking this is not sustainable?
Yeah, look, I understand that perspective. What we're trying to do is to try and lead this change in an effective way. You've seen some of the evidence, some of it's reported in the papers this morning, of some people's reaction to that in the organisation and some of the anxieties that suggests. So I think that confirms me in our view that we need to proceed gradually, but with determination.
But what does it tell you, Mr Griffin, about the culture in the civil service, where people are saying it's an infringement of their human rights to ask them to go to work?
Well, I don't think that's the. I mean, it's hard to know what is sort of, if you like, the majority view. What's the dominant culture? What we've seen in the papers this morning are certain individuals who have expressed a personal view about it. I know I've had a number of colleagues and others around this panel will as well have colleagues say to them how pleased they are with the change in policy, how positive that's going to be, and I'm confident that we'll get to a place in October where that is warmly received and that we can move forward from there. But I think in any organisation, I think you need a good understanding of the culture in which change is landing in order to be able to lead that out in an effective way, a kind way, but ultimately determination to do the right thing.
Just 2 points of clarification in respect to that policy. Should it be that civil servants are paid for their travelling time to work? Would you countenance that?
No.
Okay. And also in respect of that, if somebody refuses to come to work, are you then saying there would be disciplinary action taken against them?
No, we're not on a simple refusal to come to the office. On that sort of isolated matter, it might well be that if you're in that situation, despite all the management conversations, in spite of the process that we're putting around it, it would depend a bit if there were other aspects in play or how the posture of that individual was, the language they were using, and so on. But there isn't a sort of a narrow trigger for somebody refusing to come into the office that would lead to disciplinary measures in and of itself.
Okay, last year you reduced the working week to 35 hours. What practices and mechanisms do you have in place to monitor compliance with that working week for those who are working from home?
I may ask Leslie Fraser to answer that, please.
Yeah. So it's the responsibility of line managers and directors to oversee the working patterns and the arrangements to ensure that the work is done in their areas. We can. So
just on a point of clarification,
yes.
If somebody's high proficient and can do it in 20 hours a week, is that all right?
we're obviously delighted when people are very efficient and effective, and we know a number of colleagues do that. We also know from, for example, our flexi-time system and so on, that a number of colleagues are going above and beyond their regular hours in order to be able to deliver. In the Service of Scotland, I think, really does strike a chord with colleagues, and I see many colleagues doing that on a regular basis. So ultimately, the performance is managed locally, and we can oversee that in areas like the people executive team meetings that we have, where we can see flexi time and performance and differences between different areas in the organisation, and provide targeted support and help where that's required.
And do you have any data on the number of disciplinary cases that have been brought against civil servants who haven't complied with the working week or who haven't responded to that informal arrangements with the line managers?
I'm not aware of any, but I will check for you and see whether that is an issue. Generally, in my experience, disciplinary matters tend to be multifaceted. There's a number of things going on for an individual or in a team, and it requires a number of those issues to be worked on and resolved. Hopefully positively, but on occasion not, and that's when our disciplinary procedures would kick in.
Just two final quick points, if I may, Convener. The number of sick days has increased quite significantly within the civil service to 77,500. That's 9 days per full-time equivalent civil servant. Are you concerned about apparently a sick note culture developing in the civil service?
So I'm concerned about the figures. I think anyone in a position of responsibility wants a healthy, flourishing workforce. I think in those figures, I think I'm right in saying 6%, I think, Leslie, are related to workplace stress. So that is still 6% too many, and I would want that figure to come down, but that is not, I suppose, to some degree, some reassurance that is not a direct product of workplace environment. I think 20% is respiratory illness. I think 20% is more sort of general levels of stress and anxiety. So I think both for duty of care for the individuals and for your wider point about value to the taxpayer, I would want to see those figures come down. We've discussed them in the executive team. There's a fair bit of variance between different teams, so that is suggestive of possibly particular circumstances in play in different business areas. So the data that we're tracking there, I think, is good. When I think about accountability in my new role, I think in two respects. So one, again, the line management that I would have with my Director General colleagues, and looking to review those figures for their area on a regular basis and expecting to see improvement. And then we'll also socialise that collectively as the executive team, so there's a degree of holding each other to account. But I would share your concern, Mr. Hoy, and that's something that I intend to get some improvements on.
And finally, just with respect to the government have put great store on their Invest to Save fund to try and deliver efficiencies across government. We noticed from an FOI on the 12th of May that only 26 public sector organisations have submitted applications, and only 19 of those are, there were 7 local authorities, so only 19 are national public sector bodies. What does that tell you about the appetite for public sector reform and efficiency that so few have actually come forward with proposals to make savings within their own departments?
I think the Invest to Save fund was a specific vehicle. I think it will give us some interesting insights. It was never set up at a scale that was meant to be sort of universal, but look at some early adopters, people with specific ideas that they wanted to trial. I think we'll get a lot of learning out of that. We have to have the ability to try some things out and see how we get on with that. So I think the response overall is encouraging. I wouldn't take too much from the numbers of people that applied to say anything particularly meaningful about the appetite for change overall. In my dealings with leaders across the public sector and people working in public services, I think there is a real appetite to innovate, to change, and to better serve the public. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hoy.
Thank you. Michael, to be followed by Liz.
Mr Griffin.
Morning, Mr Mayor.
I think you may have detected a fair level of scepticism around the table regarding the civil service numbers, given that all my colleagues have been talking about them. I think there's probably some good reason for that. Certainly in May 2022, the now Deputy First Minister stated that she wanted to see the size of the civil service return to pre-COVID levels. The size of the civil service at that point was 22,800. It's now 27,400. I mean, are we not right to be sceptical about your ability to even cap that number, let alone reduce it?
I think scepticism in public life generally is quite an appropriate stance. I mean that entirely properly and respectfully, and we need to deliver this. And I think the best response that we can make to a sceptical line of inquiry for representatives of communities is to get on and deliver. I think in the period in play, again, there have been a number of unexpected shocks and a volatile situation, and that volatility unfortunately doesn't look like it's going to ease anytime soon, but the direction of travel is clear. I think the expectation of this Parliament is clear. We need to get on and deliver. It might help actually, just by way of an illustration, I know that Gregor Irwin has been doing some work locally in DG Economy and could probably speak a little bit. There's a bit of a case study to the kind of leadership and methods that we're talking about that will help get numbers down, if I may, Mr Maher.
Yeah, so Mr Maher, this example actually goes back to that period that you're referring to when the DFM made that statement. Around about that time, between April 22 and April 2023, we went through a process of restructuring and transforming DG Economy, the part of the government that I'm responsible for, and that resulted in something like a 20% reduction in headcounts. Now, that process has continued since then. It's ongoing, and there are obviously a number of things that are changing in the environment that we are contending with, which mean that you see both some parts of DG Economy we've had to increase headcount, in other areas we've had to decrease headcount. So, for example, just this year, European Structural Investment Funds, that team has been wound down. That programme has been successfully closed. At the same time, we've taken responsibility for planning in government, and we've actually increased resource for planning in government. So as well as managing down headcount in DG Economy, now once you control like for like is significantly lower than it was pre-COVID, there's also reprioritisation work that's going on within the DG area.
So February 2023, John Swinney came to FPAC, to this committee, and said, in relation to the Scottish Government, we have headcount controls in place. We are working to reduce overall staff numbers. But in the last quarter, figures published just last week, that number is going up again. It's up a further 200. I mean, those controls, it sounds to me you're talking about deprioritisation of economy. That's a concern for me, frankly, within the overall, because the overall picture is that number is continuing to rise. Current trend, Permanent Secretary, is that number is going up. Sorry, Permanent Secretary, on that point, the number is going up, isn't it?
So I think there's two things in play here. One is that the controls that I think Mr Swinney would have been referring to, the internal controls for the core civil service. So we have a recruitment committee that scrutinises any proposal for an external recruitment and any proposal for an internal recruitment as well, given there's a common citizenship with public bodies. And our direction of travel is firmly down the way. The figure that I think you might be referring to is a sort of broader conception of the civil service to also include agencies and non-ministerial departments. That's a much bigger number to begin with. And the Scottish Government...
73% bigger than it was in 2007.
Yeah, and the Scottish Government's controls over that are less direct. So the kind of recruitment, headcount controls that I think Mr Swinney is referring to are specifically to the core civil service, which numbers around 8,900.
Yeah, and these numbers are continuing to rise in the last quarter. So will we see in a year's time, will it be a failure on your part if that number is continuing to rise, given the announcements we've heard in recent days?
So the core civil service needs to come down. I'm confident that we have a number of the methods already in play. We're considering a range of others, and I think it's reasonable to hold the Permanent Secretary to account for the size of that core civil service in line with ministers' aspirations and policies. I think as regards the broader civil service, agencies, non-ministerial departments, and that wider picture of the public sector more generally. I think that's in the ballpark of what Mr McKee was talking about in terms of the 20% reductions, and the kind of levers that central government has directly aren't quite as direct as being able to scrutinise and control every individual proposal for external or internal recruitment. So I think I'd probably put it in that way.
I think there's pretty significant powers that ministers have to do things about those things. Whether they decide to use them or not directly through legislation or otherwise is a different question. Can I move on to a different area, which around, I think, probably touches on part of your previous role to intergovernmental relations within the UK. Your predecessor, stated that one of his priorities in the last year was to see a reset in the relationship with the UK government. How do you think that's going?
So I think the reset was initiated by politicians at a political level after the general election. That was the language that we heard both from the Prime Minister and from the First Minister. I note that the Prime Minister was in Edinburgh that first weekend after his election for a good meeting with Mr Swinney. They've met a number of times since then, dedicated meetings or in the margins of other wider fora, and I think there are areas where, at a ministerial level, I think there are good working relationships and a commonality of purpose, and as you might expect, there are areas where there are political differences of emphasis or difference of direction, and you would expect that. As far as the civil service is concerned, I think we do benefit from the kind of relationships that we can build with our colleagues in Whitehall, but also in Cardiff and Belfast and Dublin, actually, for that matter. And we've seen a number of examples of that recently. So we were very pleased to host something called the Civil Service Leadership Group about a month ago, which is open to all the Directors General and Permanent Secretaries across Whitehall and the Welsh Government. They came to Scotland for 2 days. We hosted a series of visits around the country to look at examples of projects to address child poverty. There was a dinner as well. The First Minister addressed them the following morning, and there was a plenary session again looking at some of the questions of civil service leadership and reform more generally. And I think that was very significant. It's the first time that's happened in Scotland for a period of time, and that was a great opportunity to further develop and build relationships. Speaking personally, since my promotion, I've been very warmly received by colleagues. I usually attend the Wednesday morning meeting of Permanent Secretaries chaired by the Cabinet Secretary, Chris Wormold. At a professional and personal level, colleagues have been very welcoming to me. And again, I saw a number of people at the British Irish Council in Newcastle, Northern Ireland, a couple of weeks ago. I think the point I'm making is that civil servants must have these close working relationships with others across these islands. I think it underpins our ability to make progress, to problem solve, to try and preempt political disagreements where otherwise they might arise. But it also means that we can provide a sort of framework where there is to be disagreement, that isn't too debilitating or that doesn't obstruct process. There is going to be political tension. The sheer number of different political poles that have been created through devolution, I think, mean inevitably there will be different parties in power in different parts of the UK, but the civil service can really have a role in underpinning continuity and making sure that our professional relationships with our opposite numbers are as close and as productive as they can be.
Okay. Thank you for all that. It's very useful. You talk about preempting political disagreement, and obviously sometimes politicians will get in the road of some of those good relationships that you have with positions that they might take. But you're the principal policy advisor to the First Minister. And since prior to the UK budget in the autumn of last year, the Scottish Government made demands of the UK Government in terms of spending. They demanded £70 billion of additional spending from the UK Government. Since that budget, there's been an additional £20 billion of demands. Were you involved, in your civil service, involved in costing those demands?
Personally, I wasn't, but for ministers to ask for specific costed things would have been the product of advice from civil servants in the Scottish Government, yeah.
So what form does, as an intergovernmental relations expert, what do those kind of demands, what form do they take? Is it just a press release? Or is it something actually that civil servants will engage with, taking asking for an additional £70 billion, will they go and say to their counterparts in the other department, this is why we've done it, this is the position, and this is why we think you should spend this money that we don't have?
I think where it works best in both directions actually is where there's good dialogue at official level and then between ministers. And then ideally, if everything progresses smoothly, you sort of reach a more sort of formal setting. At the very start of my career, I worked in the United Nations, and they almost formalised this process of different levels of interaction through formals, informal formals, and informal informals. And that's not a bad summary of how we operate as well. So I would certainly expect my colleagues both in the Scottish Government and across the civil service in Whitehall to have good levels of engagement, transparent conversations about costings and so on before we reach any point of political dialogue.
Because on top of that 90 billion of spending demands, there's also been opposition from the Scottish Government to £45 billion of revenue raisers. So a fiscal adjustment of £135 billion in terms of coming out of your offices, in terms of demands of the UK government. I mean, those aren't realistic demands, so it's not credible. So how does that talk to a reset between relationships between the Scottish Government and the UK Government when your officers are producing these forms of figures which have no real basis in reality in terms of being able to transact a relationship between two governments?
So I don't know the specific figures that you're discussing, how they're profiled over what period of time, capital, revenue, and so on. But
well, I'd be surprised if the work was done, frankly. But if there are figures from the Scottish Government.
So what I would expect is that my colleagues are giving ministers the best advice on those, not just on the figures involved, but we always need to undertake accountable officer assessments when we're proceeding with a proposition and a course of action. So the costings, as I say, I would expect my colleagues to support ministers in that way.
Mr McCallum, is your department costing these press releases?
Yeah, so I think just a couple of things to add to what the Permanent Secretary said. I mean, the discussions that happen at officials level, we have regular engagement with the Treasury, with the Treasury devolved administrations team. So the discussion about different priorities of the different governments is something that's discussed with Treasury officials. And at ministerial level, I mean, even this week, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance will be meeting with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury in London on Thursday. So there is that relationship in terms of the fiscal discussions that are happening. So where there are those, there are in terms of specific policies, these are always costed, whether that's done independently or whether that's done through economic officials within government.
So no comment in terms of the cumulative effect then, Mr Griffin, in terms of the ability to have a proper relationship with the UK government, Scottish, when your government is issuing these continuous demands for money that is just completely unrealistic. I'm worried about the stated priority of a reset, and actually if the conduct of the Scottish government is such that it's actually not being a realistic partner in those conversations.
So forgive me, I just don't know the specifics.
Okay. Maybe I'll write to you and set out.
Yeah, no,
thank
you. Yeah,
because we have some detail on it. Can I? Have you been involved in any costings? I think the answer to this is probably not, but around full fiscal autonomy.
Turn to Mr McCallum on that one.
So at the moment, I mean, the current fiscal framework is such that there's a number of policy measures that we need to work through on the existing fiscal framework that was set through the Smith Commission after 2015. That's what policy officials have been working on. So 2 examples in the current live issues around the aggregates tax and indeed the air departure tax as well. So these are all part of the current fiscal framework that we're working through. I think the position that Scottish ministers, and I think the Cabinet Secretary for Finance actually set this out at this committee 2 or 3 weeks ago on full fiscal autonomy is known, but that's not something that is actively being worked on by Exchequer officials at this time.
So no work on that. Can I ask about the your view, Mr Griffin, of the risks to the university system in Scotland? So we have had evidence on a variety of occasions regarding the challenges in the system. I think you'll be aware of it. Are you worried about the sustainability of the universities of Scotland at the moment?
I think we're seeing some specific examples coming forward. I think, obviously I know Mr Murray, you'll be particularly concerned around the position in Dundee University, and I think the report that came out was a really detailed explanation as to how that transpired. I think I would be reluctant to sort of draw generalised conclusions from what played out at Dundee University. But overall, of course, the government wants to see a flourishing university sector where it is felt that financial sustainability is achievable.
Okay, so 19th of March, the Scottish Funding Council gave evidence to the Education Committee in response to some questions that I made of them, that they were telling the Scottish Government that there are pressures in the sector. So not just Dundee, if we can, for the moment, set the Dundee situation aside, there's particular issues there, I agree with that. But there is very significant pressures right across the system. Where on your risk register would the sustainability of the system sit?
There will be a literal answer to that, which I can write to you in that we have a corporate risk register, and I think from memory that is an entry there. So if you don't mind, I can give you an empirical answer to that one.
Can I ask for something slightly more of your own reflections then?
Yeah.
Because it's something that's certainly of great concern to myself and to other colleagues as well. That the system we have at the moment, those particular instances aside, is in increased pressure, declines in international number of students, no sign of that recovering, in fact, probably getting worse. And the multiple universities with redundancy schemes in place. It's one of the jewels of Scotland. It's central to Mr Irwin's work, I'm sure, in terms of the economy of Scotland, and it's in significant distress. Are you telling the First Minister that he has to act and do something about it?
So we've had a couple of discussions at the executive team, presentation from the higher education team, sharing some of their analysis of where we are. I think the First Minister is well cited on the financial pressure being faced by some institutions. And I think it is important, as I've shared with all of my colleagues really, that where there's a need for some strategic work to be done to take stock of a situation in a given sector, that people carve out the time and space to be able to do that. So I think if there were a view emerging among ministers that was something they wanted to see happen, then we would absolutely be able to do that and give them good advice.
Worried by the reflections in the Gillies review in terms of the lack of efficacy of the Scottish Funding Council in terms of its governorship of the overall fiscal financial sustainability of the sector?
I think there's a number of things in the Gillies review that you would not want to see happen in the conduct of...
But specific to the broader sector rather than Dundee. So there's actual specific questions about the Scottish Funding Council. So
I think the Funding Council has a new chief executive there, and I have every confidence in her leadership to take a lot of the learning from the Dundee situation and to apply that to the sector as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Followed by John.
Thank you. May I ask just one clarification before I come to my own questions? Mr Griffin, can you tell us whether you are actually advising the First Minister that there are significant issues in the higher education sector, or are you waiting for Mr Swinney to come back to you?
So I think it's largely playing out through the education relationship. My colleague Neil Rennick, who's the Director General for Education and Justice and the Cabinet Secretary for Education, Ms Gilruth. The First Minister and I personally have touched on the position in Dundee on a number of occasions. To my recollection, we haven't had a one-to-one discussion about the sector overall at this point.
I find that
a few weeks into the role.
I find that a bit concerning, I have to say. Anyway, on other issues, can I come to an issue that is troubling this committee a great deal, and that relates to transparency and to good government. Because let's be honest, our job is to scrutinise both of these in relation to the spend of public money. And I would like to ask you if you feel that in the context of the increasing number of framework bills in this Parliament, which by their very nature mean that it's very difficult for a minister to put on the table the full cost because there is ongoing stakeholder engagement, and that in turn has led to a number of financial memorandum about which we have not been at all satisfied. In fact, we've sent several of them back. Do you think the growing number of framework bills is a problem?
I think framework bills have their place where you need to be able to approach an issue at some breadth, and you need a degree of flexibility about how you implement them. But it is important to me that Parliament gets the right kind of information as regards the financial implications of any bill, let alone a framework bill. So I do understand the concern of the committee. That is something that we have taken into government. I think Mr Hepburn wrote to the committee on the 6th of March to confirm that the finance guidance note on preparing memoranda, which goes with the Scottish Public Finance Manual, has been updated to ensure that committee's view are given greater prominence. And we've also updated our internal guidance on the preparation of bills. So I think your concerns have been heard. I think we've responded to that in the way that I've discussed. I think with any implementation of a change of policy or guidance in this way, what then really matters is the follow-through. So the way that I think about that, first of all, is through the sort of line management operation. So I would expect my Directors General, who are in charge of the particular policy or legislation concerned, to take heed of the concerns that have been expressed. I would think about the system, so through our assurance committees, the input of non-executive directors, risk and audit committees and so on, that also to be highlighted and taken into account. And then there's a sort of third level around the culture, where I will be, together with my colleagues, talking about these matters, setting the highest example for how we communicate financial information connected with any piece of legislation.
Helpful, but nonetheless there is a structural issue here, because framework bills, given how they operate, make it much more difficult to provide an accurate financial memorandum by their very definition, because there's ongoing engagement with stakeholders and therefore there are ongoing future costs, and it's very difficult to calculate what these are. Our concern in this committee is that recently we've had quite a number of financial memoranda that are nowhere near accurate. And that, in turn, is about public money, and it makes our scrutiny of that public money spend very difficult. Is that a matter that is giving concern to yourself and to your officials?
Yeah, it absolutely would be of a concern to me if we were providing inadequate financial analysis and information to any parliamentary committee. And so, as I said, that has been brought back into government. The relevant guidance has been updated. As I say, it then needs to be implemented and followed through, and I've given you some of the ways in which we need to do that. But it matters a lot to me that we provide accurate and effective financial information so the government can be properly scrutinised.
And is there also a concern that the number of bills that have come to this Parliament are seeing very considerable numbers of amendments, particularly at stages 2 and 3, and that it's becoming much more difficult for the Parliament to get through government business because of the size and complexity of a lot of these bills. And often, in many cases, I could think of 3 bills, and probably today's one as well, where quite a number of amendments have been accepted, and yet people are not going to move them, or they'll just be rejected. And is that a concern about the process of government, in particular legislation? Is that something that's concerning yourself?
So I would say in my first few weeks that's not something that's been brought to me as a matter of urgency. I know that we have very good teams who work together on bills, and in my previous role I line managed our parliamentary council, and his team, and Andy Beattie is very, very experienced, well regarded parliamentary council. So I would expect that in the process of preparing bills and thinking about the strategy, that all good advice was being taken from professionals in the conduct and operation of those bills. But the straight answer to your question is that's not been something that's been brought to my attention.
There is a feeling amongst the public, and indeed amongst some of the parliamentarians, that over the course of a reasonable length of time now, we have been passing legislation that is far from perfect. We've had to come back. In some cases, we've had to repeal. And I would suggest to you that one of the reasons for that is because the actual legislative process of this Parliament has become much more complex and much more difficult. And that must be a concern in regard to good government and the accountability for public money. That must be a concern.
I think you would want an optimised bill process. So you would want strong propositions, strong understanding of the impact of the legislation, strong analysis as regards equality and human rights implications, good and accurate financial information, and then the conduct of the bill in such a way that allowed for good debate, and then also a kind of orderly.
So is this a conversation that is going on between yourself and your officials and the Scottish Government, that they need to upgrade some of the process in this Parliament?
So, as I say, in my first few weeks, it hasn't been something that I've personally looked at yet. I recognise the strength of feeling of what you're saying. I'm happy to take that back and make that a priority for the next little period.
Yeah, I'll just finish on the point. I think it's very important, Permanent Secretary, because this Parliament has to work well.
Of course.
And to ensure that it does work well, the committees have to work well. And the bigger the frustration that we find, particularly from a financial angle, the more difficult it is for us to produce effective scrutiny. And with all due respect, I don't think that's our fault. I think we try our best to ensure that we're taking all the facts to hand and scrutinising as much as we can. But we are frustrated because of a number of aspects of the way that the legislation is being presented to us, and most especially the financial memorandum that are accompanying that. So if we can perhaps recommend that is a big discussion to be had with the Scottish Government, I think we would greatly appreciate that.
So I hear that, Ms Smith, and the strength of feeling in behind it. I mentioned some aspects of public life in Scotland earlier on, and I think that sense of shared stewardship for the institutions of public life is something that I feel my colleagues would feel. So, as I say, I hear the points you're making and the strength of feeling. I'll certainly look into that. Thank you.
John.
Thanks, Convener, very much. Yeah, maybe to follow on, you've had quite a lot of questions from my colleagues, so one or 2 points I'll pick up. We've talked about the size of the civil service reducing. Now, I think that's also happening in the UK level, and I just wonder how the two interact. I mean, obviously, if the UK civil service reduces, that may mean we get less money through the block grant. So are the two combined in any way, or are you just looking at Scotland?
I think there's a high degree of devolution in the way that the civil service operates in Scotland. As I said, civil service pay is reserved to Westminster, but in terms of the decisions about policy and operations, they are devolved to the First Minister, and in turn there's a scheme of delegation to me as Permanent Secretary. I think we are in a good position of being able to be well informed about the direction of travel at Westminster and Cardiff and Northern Ireland and anywhere else that we can learn good lessons about good public administration. and then look at things in our own context, our own relationship with our unions, for example, our workforce, and of course ministers' views on the matter. So I think that there is so much happening in the civil service space I take to be a positive thing, and I think we are reasonably well plugged in following that, and we can be in a position to take the good aspects from that and apply them here.
Okay, thank you. One of the challenges we sometimes have in Scotland is that an announcement's made at Westminster that there's going to be spending on, might be capital or it might be resource, but because we don't know where that money is coming from, we don't know if we're going to get extra money or not. So sometimes it's coming out of an existing departmental budget, and therefore there's no extra money, therefore we won't get any. But we don't always know that at the time. And I don't know if that's something that the civil servants, if you're speaking to your colleagues at Westminster, or if it's because they actually don't know themselves because the government ministers have made an announcement or as to a new expenditure, but they might be borrowing or they might be doing something else. Is that a space, do you think, we can see any improvement in?
I'll ask Richard McCallum's probably the expert on this. I think my observation, based on experience, is that it may not always be absolutely crystal clear in the full first throes of the announcement, but it is in due course. I mean, there is a process that colleagues have to go through to be specific about budgets and so on, which then does bring that level of clarity through budget revisions or the block grant adjustments or other mechanisms. But Richard will be the expert on this.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mason. I think probably what you've said is right. I think the key thing for us from a kind of Scottish Exchequer perspective is the fiscal events that there are at Westminster. And when there is a fiscal event, for example, the recent spending review, we will get a formal statement from the Treasury of this is what it means for the consequentials, the Barnett consequentials that Scotland receives. As you say, sometimes where there is a policy announcement, it's not always as clear. But as I said earlier to Mr. Marrow, we have good lines of communication with the Treasury on those things, and often it is the case that outside of those kind of core fiscal events that I was talking about, the normal process would be that's money from within department budgets, and therefore there wouldn't be an associated consequential.
So if we took something like HS2, which appears to be overrunning, do we assume that that's within a departmental budget, or do we think there might be extra money coming to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. In most instances where so there is a calculation that works out the level of Barnett consequential that we receive. Where it's a more reserved matter, and not all of the transport budget, is there a kind of direct consequential, we wouldn't receive an associated level of funding. So we have a pretty good understanding of the means of that calculation. As I say, there's a good dialogue between Treasury and Scottish Government. So we will know if there are particular additional costs, if that changes the budget of a particular department, how that will then apply to the Scottish Government settlement.
Okay, we'll probably follow up on that one in future as well. When it comes to the actual fiscal framework, you've already been asked about that. I mean, I certainly feel that Scotland gets a raw deal, and other Scottish politicians might say the same. Obviously, the Westminster politicians think that Scotland's being dealt with very generously. And then a couple of years ago, except before you were in place, Shona Robinson had these discussions with the Treasury. Where does that leave the civil service? Because on the one hand, Scottish ministers are expecting support from you to argue the case for Scotland. Westminster civil servants are arguing the case for the UK. Is that a problem, or is that just handled?
Well, I think it goes back to some of the answers I gave to Mr. Mara's line of questioning. I think it's very important that civil servants serving different sets of ministers are able to have good, honest, evidence-based dialogue, if you like, aside from the public debate that takes place between politicians, and that's absolutely normal. And across, as I say, across these islands, more often than not, you are going to have different parties in power and different administrations. So the civil service has to be able to provide that continuity and a dialogue to prepare the ministerial narrative. So, yeah, it would be incumbent on us to serve our ministers and our colleagues in the UK government to serve theirs, same as our colleagues in Cardiff to serve the Welsh government.
Okay. Now, the convener asked you about the public inquiries, which we've been spending quite a lot of time on, and we're partway through our inquiry at the moment. Can you just give us a little bit about background as to what happens when a public inquiry is being set up? I mean, does a minister come to you and say, I've decided to have a public inquiry? Or do they come to you and say, do you think I should have a public inquiry? Or does it just vary from case to case? And it's been suggested that there could be, for example, a part of the civil service that really supports public inquiries and gives guidance and all of that. Can you give us any kind of background in that space?
Yeah, of course. So when thinking about the type of inquiry or investigation that's needed, ministers will obviously take into account the details and background of each event, with the capability to cause, the level of public concern, and assess this against what's possible. And we would provide them with the advice based on statute, based on experience, based on lessons, likely cost, and so on and so forth. And then into a discussion about who might be an appropriate person to lead the inquiry. There's usually dialogue between ministers, civil servants, and the head of that inquiry from the outset. But once the inquiry really begins, the chair then has a fair amount of autonomy to pursue that in the way that they assess. I think we are not bad at sharing the lessons of inquiries past, partly because I think I'm right in saying that there is a team who are specifically aligned to the inquiry's legislation. So the early genesis of an inquiry, those very early discussions, that is usually the same team. That then branches out into the different policy areas concerned. So if there's an inquiry in health, that would then go to a health team and so on. Again, as I said earlier on, I think the work that you are doing as a committee to investigate the different aspects of this, the public value, the public interest and so on, is such that if you come out with recommendations, I for one would have an open mind about the civil service aspects of that. Were you to recommend us to change our practice, I would look at that very carefully. And as I say, I have an open mind in any changes we might make.
I mean, one of the issues that's come up from witnesses has been the importance of the terms of reference.
Yeah.
So is that something, I mean, again, is that kind of negotiation with the chair, or is that something, do you have a kind of framework for terms of reference that keeps it quite tight? Because it strikes us that, or strikes me, that if the terms of reference are very wide, then it's just going to roll on forever.
So I think this comes to the 2005 Inquiries Act. So under that, ministers have the power to establish the inquiry and to set the terms of reference. In my experience, and I think this is probably good practice, you wouldn't sort of impose that on a chair. You would share the proposed terms of reference. Again, you would be open to a reasoned adjustment on that individual's behalf, but ultimately you've got that power under the Inquiries Act, sits with ministers. So you would want some dialogue, I imagine, but that would be the nature of the conversation.
Okay. Now, I was looking at the paper Future Trends for Scotland, which raises a wide range of issues. So I'll not ask you about all of them, but I did pick out 3 that are coming along. So artificial intelligence. Can you say anything about how the civil service is dealing with that?
Yeah, I think this operates at a couple of levels. So one is, I suppose, a more parochial one about how we might deploy artificial intelligence in our work to assist with some of the efficiency and effectiveness concerns that the committee has raised this morning. We have deployed quite a lot already of intelligent automation, which Leslie Fraser may be able to speak more to, and some good case studies of where that's happened. And then latterly around artificial intelligence and large language learning models, we've been using Copilot on a pilot basis, again, to look at whether that can assist us with some of the routine tasks around taking minutes, for example, synthesizing bits of information. And there's no reason to think that there isn't a lot of potential in some of these things to assist the civil service to be efficient and effective. The other area is a much broader one about the application of AI in the economy and the society more generally. Gregor Owen might want to say something about that based on the conversations he has with business leaders and industry. But I'll leave it there, Mr. Mason, to see what your level of appetite is for either of those.
No, I mean, it's a huge area, and I just wanted to touch on it today because it hadn't been mentioned, but
okay.
I didn't want. I'm not going to go into. But if Mr. Irwin wants to say something, he's welcome.
Yeah, happy to do that. So, as part of the programme for government, we're setting up AI Scotland, which is really a coalition of different parties that are going to come together to drive deployment of AI within the Scottish economy. The exact way in which that is being done, that's under discussion and being worked through at the moment. But essentially, it involves bringing together public sector working with private sector in a constructive manner. The way I would think about AI and its impact and deployment across the economy is not to just think about it as AI, but to think about it as being intrinsically linked to innovation in the economy and the development of the digital economy. So AI is one means by which to achieve those outcomes. So that's the spirit in which we are seeking to work with economic partners to do just that. The other thing I should mention is, of course, we're mindful of the impact of AI and technology on the labour market and the potential for disruption to the labour market, what that means in terms of skills provision and support, and that element as well. Still relatively early days in seeing the transformational impact that we expect that those technologies will have on the economy, but it's something that we're paying close attention to.
Okay, thank you. Second out of the future trends, cyber attacks. How safe is the Scottish Government from that?
So Leslie Fraser may want to say a bit on this. When I think about the sort of introductory briefings that I have had and contacts with my colleagues in Whitehall, I would say this is an area that I am concerned about, that I do need assurance, that we have good arrangements in place. I think we do have good systems across the Scottish public sector, but we are really only as ever as resilient as some of the weakest links in the chain. That is going to need investment in the years to come to update legacy systems and to make sure that we're well protected. And unfortunately, we know through strategic defence review and other aspects that we are potentially vulnerable to hostile state actors in this space as well. So in terms of my sort of risk, and again, it does sit on our corporate risk register, it's one of those areas that I think senior leaders do need to be pretty restless in looking for those levels of assurance and preparedness. But Leslie may wish to say a little bit more.
Happy to. It's one of the areas that we've been investing in recent years, and we've brought together the cyber capability within the Scottish Government together with cyber resilience capability for the wider public sector, so that we're able to do that once for Scotland and offer an integrated service and aim to ensure that people have got access to really high quality cyber defence insight and information. We do work, this is another area where we work very closely with our UK government colleagues, again, just to draw on the expertise and insight and the awareness of where particular threats
because there have been one or two public bodies, I think one of the health boards, that have suffered a bit.
It's sadly the case that public and private sector are pretty much constantly being tested in this area, yes.
And finally, it talks about the risk of pandemics increasing. Are we ready for the next pandemic?
So we are, I'm assured that we're taking effective steps in response to the COVID inquiry. UK COVID inquiry, the first inquiry to produce recommendations. So Module 1 dealt with preparedness, and Baroness Hallett sent some pretty exacting expectations in terms of how she was going to monitor progress there. So we're reporting along to the timescales that she has asked for. So I think we have good experienced resource in that area. We've got the resilience operation fully plugged in, working with partners, and I'm confident that we are working on those recommendations and that we are preparing effectively, clearly, there's a series of other modules still to come, and what I expect and what I hope for is that those recommendations really assist us in taking the necessary steps. But that clearly is something of great importance that we need to do.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you. And a brief question from Craig.
Just something that I thought may have come up, but hasn't. Just in relation to the Scottish Government's policy on no compulsory redundancies, we took evidence from a number of public bodies, all of whom said whilst they would not intend necessarily and routinely to use compulsory redundancies, it would be another tool to their toolkit. What is your thinking as we embark on public service reform and civil service reform in adding that potential tool to your toolkit so that you could make sure that you have the whole panoply of options ahead of you?
Yeah, so in general, that policy is extant. I think there are circumstances in which ministers do permit public bodies to pursue that. And Gregor may want to say something about Visit Scotland, which is a recent example of where that has taken place.
So the policy is that compulsory redundancies only happen as a last resort, and that exhaustive efforts to redeploy and reskill impacted staff need to be made and need to continue. Visit Scotland has gone through a very substantial programme of reorganisation to digitalise, essentially, to recognise that the work of Visit Scotland has to happen before tourists actually arrive in destinations. So that's resulted in the closure programme for the eye centres and the redeployment of staff and the move to digital provision of services. So they have gone through that process of redeployment, but also voluntary redundancy schemes. And now there is the prospect of a degree of compulsory redundancy potentially as a very last resort in that process. But that's very much been done in a way which is consistent with the policy that I've just described.
But is it something you would support as you embark on this process?
Well, I mean, that really is a policy choice for ministers. It didn't feature significantly in the public sector reform strategy. We'll see what happens with Visit Scotland and whether there's learning from that we'll take into the system.
And just lastly, and very briefly, your predecessor said to us when he appeared before us, before his departure, that he thought the growing gap, and I know it's dynamic and it goes up and down at different points in time, between what we're receiving in Barnett consequentials for social security and what we're spending, he described that as material but manageable. Would that be your view at this present point in time as well?
I think, as often JP Marks has put that well, medium-term financial strategy published tomorrow will say a bit more about those matters.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We've had a very wide-ranging number of questions, so I want to thank you for answering them. It can't be easy to draw on so many different sources of information. Simultaneously, I know you're going to follow up one or two in writing, but just before we conclude, I just wonder if there's any further points you wish to make to the committee.
I wasn't expecting that question, Convener, actually. No, I don't think so. As you say, we've ranged far and wide. Maybe just to say it's a matter of great pride to me personally to be in this role after so many years in the Scottish administration. Very proud of the team that we have, and I assure you we'll do our absolute best to serve communities across Scotland.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. We now can have ended this session. We will have a 5-minute break before we move into private session, just to allow our witnesses and indeed the broadcasting and official report to leave. So thank you. Thanks very much.